Maybe we could just talk a little bit about your story.
I was really middle-class America. Grew up in a family of 5 children and mom and dad, and there was no alcohol, no drugs that were involved in growing up or even in my community.
Okay, so for you, this didn't really kind of hit home until things started to change for your son.
That's correct. I had 2 boys, and my oldest was an Army Ranger, Green Beret, and he was injured when he was in training, and the Army put him on Percocet to ease the back pain, which escalated. He needed more and more, and eventually he was buying drugs off of the street, and eventually it escalated to his use of meth and heroin, and he was arrested and eventually put into assigned to a rehab program for a year and a half. And I supported him through that experience.
So it sounds like it got pretty rough, but it may have started off with him doing quite well in life, being a Green Beret. When did you start to notice that something was going on?
Really, it was in high school. He was in the gifted program, but he was always like the square peg trying to fit into the round hole and always felt as an outsider. And he started using alcohol when he was in high school and saw some of the danger signs then and took him to counseling. But it was really after he was out on his own, after he was 18, that his addiction really escalated.
What was going on that you saw even in high school, danger signs enough that you took him to counseling?
He would keep to himself a lot. He would break the rules. He was quite obstinate and sneak out of the house at night. I was a single parent, and so enforcing the rules was left to me alone. And he didn't have a lot of friends. He had a few close friends, but rebellious at school and not a lot of friendships.
How about later on, as he was taking Percocets, did you notice anything was awry, or?
Well, at that time he was stationed in Louisiana and I was living in Virginia. And so I wasn't around him to see him on a daily basis to even know what was going on. I would always feel like there was something awry when he didn't call. Then I would know that he was covering up something. I think one of the devastating events that happened to him was he was sent overseas to Bosnia as a peacekeeping force and really saw some horrific happenings in that country. And when he came home, he truly was a changed person, and he was only 19 at the time. Since has been diagnosed with PTSD, but really went through significant trauma in his early years in the Army.
So some of this might have been kind of developing even outside of your awareness because it's happening, many miles away on a base. When did you start to were there sort of some initial signs that things were getting worse?
When he would come later on, when he would come to visit me when he was on leave, I would notice that he was either drinking too much or was rather secretive, would stay in his room a lot, was rather uncommunicative. Some of those were the signs that he exhibited.
Was there a point where it became like kind of undeniably clear what was happening, or when did you realize that an addiction was happening?
He did have an honorable discharge from the Army, but he had a few incidences when he was in the Army that rather forced him out because he would not have been promoted. And after he got out of the Army and he came to live with me, I really noticed he was unemployed, very troubled. When his meth use started, he was up all night long and had very erratic behavior, and I confronted him about his behavior.
What was that like?
At first, there was denial, and then blaming me, but eventually, when he was ready, he got to the point where he said, I can't stand living like this anymore, and he voluntarily went to the VA to enter a rehab program.
If we go back to that, you confronting him, was that, what was that like for you?
The whole experience was surreal in many ways. When you're a parent and you're raising a child, you have the highest hopes for them when they're young children, and you never expect that they will be involved in drugs or be arrested or be in jail. So it was almost surreal, like it wasn't almost happening to me. When I had to confront him, there had been so much hurt, secrecy, denial, that I knew it was something that I had to do, and researched how to confront him. And he and his brother and I both sat him down and talked with him.
You mentioned the hurt. What's hurtful for a parent who's got a son that's addicted?
I think you see your child not living up to their potential. You see their whole life being sidetracked. Their relationships suffer with family, with friends. Their entire focus is on getting the next fix of drugs rather than on participating in family events. Going down a road of visiting him in jail, having to talk on a telephone and look at him through a plexiglass barrier. You just don't imagine that that's going to happen. And the lies, the secrecy, the theft. He stole almost all of my precious jewelry and just did a lot of destruction around the house, too.
When you visited him in jail, what had happened? He'd gone from being a Green Beret to being in jail. Do you know what the charges were?
He had stolen items from the store to pay for drugs. And so he was arrested on, I think, 2 felony charges. And at that time, I had no idea what his future would hold, whether he would be going to prison. But definitely his entire life was sidetracked and had come to a great crashing halt.
How about for you at this time? What's going on for you when you're watching this happen?
My heart was broken. This was my firstborn son. I had so much pride in him, loved him intensely, and the hurt of seeing him hurt was, and the betrayal that had happened to me just hit my heart and pierced it.
How did you deal with that?
Through a lot of prayer and seeking guidance from other people that had been through the experience, knowing that I needed to love him just the way he was and to encourage him and to pray for him that God would take away his desire for drugs and alcohol.
You needed to love him the way he was.
I think we follow Jesus' example. His life is a blueprint for our lives. And Jesus met everyone right where they were, accepted them as they were, and loved them. And even though there was hurt, I had to put that aside and be there for him in the most loving way possible.
Well, it sounds like that's a pretty incredible thing to learn and to be able to do. Was there anything that you learned through this experience, or anything that, even out of something dark, was there something that changed or that you gained even?
A lot of it was acceptance, accepting the situation as it was, accepting him the way he was, and eventually the most painful experience of my life became a blessing to me in creating for me a mission for my retirement years.
Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit?
It really started at my church. My church has been a haven for men and women that are in recovery houses, and they come to church regularly. In many instances, they look different than the rest of the congregation. And as a greeter at the front gate of our church, I felt like it was really my job to make them feel welcome and to reach out to them and to introduce myself and to find out what their names were so that I could greet them each and every week. And through that, I learned about the Resilient Recovery Program.
Yeah, what's maybe just at church, what have been some of the experiences that you've had reaching out to folks?
I've really become almost good friends with a lot of the participants of the recovery houses. It has been such a blessing to me to offer support and encouragement and give them a welcoming hand into our congregation.
Mm-hmm. And you say it's been a blessing to you. How sounds like you're the one doing a lot of the outreaching and greeting of people and so on. How has it been a blessing to you?
When I first started in the Resilient Recovery Program, I started as a volunteer and started attending some of the group sessions. And through that experience, I have learned so much about the experiences of the participants. Really devastating stories, and yet I admire their courage in coming to the program and wanting to change their life. I've heard their story. I've heard their conviction of wanting to change their life. I've seen their love of Christ. I've seen lives change, and I feel very privileged to have been a part of that in encouraging them and just loving them.
Is there anyone in particular that kind of stands out?
Many of the women in the program have had their children taken away from them. And I know that's been an extremely painful process. And being a resident in the program, they're away from their families and they miss their families. For some of the men, they've been in and out of prison, and their lives have been definitely sidetracked. They've burned a lot of bridges with their families, and yet I've seen their whole demeanor change. I've seen them come from a very rough exterior coming out of prison where they've had to have walls of defenses up to where they have softened and shared with groups their most painful experiences and how they have learned from them and changed and grown into a very happy individual that is willing to help others on their road to recovery.
You don't have to use a first name, but is there somebody in particular that, something that they said or some change that you've seen that's been meaningful to you? Or
one gentleman in particular has had a very dark past. He came to drinking and drugs at a very young age and has been in and out of jail and prison, has been stabbed, shot at, been in gang activities, and has become one of the happiest individuals that I see. Has volunteered at the church to be an active participant at church, to be part of the community at church, and just has a joy of life to him, which is directly accredited to the Resilient program.
You mentioned kind of this pattern that you see where out of difficulty or out of darkness, something positive happens. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I remember with my son, when he was in active use, he was smoking and drinking and using drugs. When you take those elements out of your life, there is a void. There's like a black hole inside of you after taking the addictions away. And the only thing that fills that void and fills it to the brim is the grace and mercy of God. And I've seen that happen with the participants when they go through the program and they're confessing their sins, but then truly experiencing the grace of God and the mercy that is bestowed on each one of them.
That's cool to see, for sure. What would you say to somebody who maybe hasn't seen kind of the meetings that we do and what happens in the meetings? How would you describe what happens and what you've seen?
Well, there are two parts to each session that we do, and one goes over what God's expectations in the law is and leads them really to examine themselves, the sins and the faults and the failures that they've had in their past, and gives a prayer time for them to confess that to God. But the flip side is to see that God's grace and forgiveness is there for them, that they only have to reach out and experience and accept the forgiveness, the total forgiveness that Christ gives to each one of them.
If you were able to speak to a potential donor to Resilient, what would you want to tell them?
I feel like the little bit that I have given within the ministry has been returned to me 100-fold. The blessings that I have received from each one of the participants and my own spiritual growth in watching lives truly changed through this program. Whatever is given will be given back to you 100-fold. To know that you have changed lives, that you have given the hopeless a hope for the future is priceless.
Thank you. Anything else that you wanted to share or that you wanted to communicate?
Well, I would just urge anyone to participate, to volunteer in the program. I think that you will find that it is well rewarded, that it gives you a new meaning and purpose for your life, and maybe a part of your ministry that God has called you to.
Any Thank you. Any words for maybe a parent or a loved one who's in the thick of watching a loved one with addiction? You've been there. What do you wish someone had let you know?
That there's always hope. That there is a brighter future for each one of them. And to accept your child where they are, to love them, to point them in the right direction, to encourage them, to love them as Christ loves each and every one of them.
I got Jesus in my mind. In this world I live.